Hey man, what's happening?
Check this out, man. This is a story about a comedy duo
Who became household names and changed comedy, but also cultural attitudes, particularly towards a certain class of medicine.
Where did they come from, and will Cheech convince his man to pass it along?
Where did they come from? Cotton-eyed Chong. Thomas Chong is the son of a Chinese father and a Scotch-Irish mother. There's some native in there too, but anyways, he grew up in Calgary, Alberta. In other words, he grew up in the heart of Canadian Texas, where he felt a little isolated because some of these cowboy white kids would give him a hard time.
And he had it especially rough living in an orphanage for a while, because after his father returned from WW2, both his parents fell quite ill, rendered unfit to take care of their kids. They would eventually recover, but not before their kids got some of that street education. So Tommy and his brother had to learn how to fight. In fact, Tommy gained a bit of a reputation as a sucker punch ninja. I mean, in an openly hostile environment like that, it's just their fault for slipping on some stairs, and then not getting up and getting trampled and booted. So Tommy's answer to being targeted like this was to start identifying with a handful of black kids in Calgary. He also became a pretty serious delinquent. He and his friends would borrow people's cars, without asking, and take them on little joyrides. It's never a good look when the kids start realizing that legally, being a minor is like being a foreign diplomat, but from one of those countries that no one really likes. It was during his time in jail after one of these stunts that he tried his first burning bush, which was given to him by a Chinese jazz musician. But anyways, in Tommy's words, black culture was all about singing and dancing, and that's how he got into music. And any kind of behavior is strongly reinforced when a lad finds that it's a great way to get girls. Pretty soon, he was part of a band called The Shades, which for a while included his brother. They were called such because no one in the group was white. They would perform at Calgary's Bowness Park, and they had a teen club at the downtown Legion Hall, because calling it a teen club functioned as a loophole to keep it from being shut down by the authorities, and possibly keeping those high school girls coming around. They played a lot of relatively fresh and obscure music coming from the States, making square dancers look like squares. The Shades mostly played soul to my understanding, but overall they were a rock and roll band. So rock and roll in fact, that in 1958 they were called to Calgary Mayor Don McKay's office and told to split town.
The crew soon decided to relocate to Vancouver, which all I know is it's full of Asians and junkies.
So kind of like Southern California, except they're turning the redwood pines into chopsticks. In Vancouver, Tommy Chong and fellow bandmate Tommy Melton opened a nightclub called the Blues Palace. Although, according to the wiki page, this club was called the Blue Balls, but that name just doesn't even fit, At this point in time, the band was now called Little Daddy and the Bachelors, and they got to record a cover of Chuck Berry's Too Much Monkey Business after winning a Battle of the Bands contest. And clearly they were doing alright, or at least knew the right people, because pretty soon Chong opened another nightclub called the Elegant Parlor. They became the house band there and met many different musicians, including Jimi Hendrix, who they jammed with. It was there that they were discovered by a Motown group called the Supremes, and got Motown Records owner Berry Gordy to sign them. It didn't all go without any hiccups though, like when on Tommy Chong's suggestion they changed the band name to 4 N's and a C.
The name change was a bad move, and they lost much of their fan base. But nonetheless, after changing the name to Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers, they signed with Motown Records and started touring. No doubt it was a blast and a half, and they actually ran into the Jackson 5, who Bobby Taylor started mentoring. One problem though, they were touring in the US and Chong didn't actually have his green card.
And when he went to go apply for one and showed up late to either a gig or a band meeting,
he was fired on the spot. He was offered the job back
just as soon as Berry Gordy realized the unreasonableness of his firing.
But a switch had already been flipped in Tommy's brain. He said he wanted to be a Berry Gordy someday, not just work for one. So he was given a nice severance package, and he would continue to dabble in music for a while, spending some time as a songwriter in LA. But more or less, this is Tommy's background before he ever even touched comedy. And by the way, at this point in his life, he was already a big fan of the cachet crop, if you catch my drift. And general attitudes about it were much more negative than they are today. That one movie from the 30s had a lot of influence. So there was another club that Tommy, as well as his family, started running in Vancouver while he was still touring. This one was a dinner club that he had converted to a strip, the very first of its kind in Vancouver. They called it the Shanghai Junk. They actually struggled even to keep their liquor license, and still they started calling the club a Music Appreciation Society. And with that, the pasties that the girls had to wear came off as well. The trouble was though, that even with all that novelty going for it, the club was in a pretty rough part of town, and the drunks and bikers and such would use the club as a hangout spot, but they weren't really paying much attention to the girls. Maybe he just had the wrong type of drunks and bikers for his business model. Like these guys might have been the sort to go to the bad part of Chinatown just to give each other happy endings under the table, because everybody needs a secret handshake, man. Or maybe it was the girls, like they had good charms but bad attitudes, who knows. But I mean, I'm just saying, it would have been the perfect cover, right? All that leather and denim. And the drunks are just like, ooh, I'm not gonna remember tonight. I could blow a 2 at one point. I mean, 2.1. So Tommy had another idea for the club. While he was touring with the band, he had seen the comedy performances of Second City as well as The Committee in San Francisco. He wanted to start putting on improv comedy performances at the club, so he did. And he used the girls in these performances, so it was kind of like a burlesque show. He got a security guard involved in the shows too, and developed a regular improv group, which included one serious actor to play the straight man in their performances. But one day, that man's wife discovered the kind of place that he was working in, and basically dragged him away by the ear. And so, they needed to find a new straight man for their act. Dun dun dun.
When Richard Marin was born, his uncle declared that he looked like a little chicharron, or fried pork rind, a popular Mexican treat.
I'm guessing it's kind of like bacon, but anyways, that's how he got the nickname Cheech. According to Cheech, he first grew up in a black community and then grew up some more in a white one, both in southern Los Angeles. Cheech himself is the son of 2 Mexican Americans, and he identifies himself specifically as Chicano, a term which was created by Mexicans to belittle their Americanized counterparts. But the term has since been taken up willingly by members of the Mexican American community as a way to differentiate themselves and their culture. Cheech's father was a police sergeant in the LAPD and a former Navy guy. He taught Cheech self-discipline and the always be working mentality that would prove invaluable in Cheech's life. And like Chong, Cheech got involved in music from a young age, particularly singing, and in college he got involved in pottery in an attempt to chase after a girl.
But I mean, why didn't he use the music to try and get girls? That's pretty much settled science, man. So I guess either there's something I don't know about pottery, or a lot of those pots were coming out hourglass shaped. Cheech also took up meditation while in college, because taking siestas would be too vanilla Mexican of him. Everything changed for Cheech the day that he got his draft card.
They wanted to ship him out to the jungles of Vietnam, but that was not his deal.
I mean, what's he gonna do? Take all his pots and earn their trust by pretending to be the Ming Dynasty? He got himself involved in the anti-draft movement.
Muhammad Ali even signed his draft card, but he got a little anxious though when his fellow anti-drafters started getting sentences.
Cheech actually had something called a student deferment, which would have got him out of it if it weren't for a certain military general who called for people who vandalized or turned in their draft cards to be reclassified as fit for military service, regardless of deferments. This reclassification would be later declared illegal by a US court, but Cheech didn't have time to wait around for that.
So he decided to just flee the country until hopefully this whole thing blows over. It was his pottery teacher who provided the assistance Cheech needed to set himself up in Canada. Being a proud Chicano, he flees from Southern California all the way to Canada instead of Mexico. It's like Superman, you know? If he goes south, he becomes just another Mexican.
And as it happens, he set up in Bragg Creek, just outside of Calgary, where he would live with and try to become the apprentice of Ed Dradenchuk, a renowned potter. Cheech had lied about his credentials in order to get this job and place to stay, but he used his work ethic and his humor, such as pretending to be their Saint Bernard to get Ed and his wife to take a liking to him anyways. So Cheech's first job outside of pottery was bartending, which pretty soon turned into a singing gig. What can I say, he's a worker. Then he moved to Banff to chase snow bunnies. Got himself a job as a cook, again by lying about his experience in the field. But he wasn't the greatest of skiers either. He ends up breaking his leg pretty bad by crashing into a bus.
By the way, Cheech was quite against the grimy Renard all the way up until university when he was finally convinced to try it. His attitude towards the stuff did a complete 180 from there, and he's just like, what else have they been lying to me about? So Cheech, always the worker, ended up in Vancouver, where Cheech was, among other things, delivering rugs and doing a little singing. And it was through a mutual friend that Cheech was introduced to Chong as a candidate for the role of straight man in his improv act. Cheech already had a reputation for being a naturally funny guy, as well as one who's willing to put in work, and you just never know where some random talent will take you if you let it. When talking about their first meeting, Chong has stated that he took one look at the girl that Cheech had brought with him, and thought to himself, yeah, there must be something to this guy, and so he got the part. One thing I forgot to mention, by the way, is that Tommy's dad, who's usually mentioned as being a trucker, grew up in hard times. He was born in Vancouver's Canton Alley, a place where many of the poorly treated Chinese laborers for the Canadian Pacific Railway were housed, and the family he had managed to start also struggled financially while Tommy was growing up. Tommy even remembers once praying that his dad would land a job. He says that his dad harbored a wish to be white because life was so hard being a Chinese Canadian, which is also why he married a white girl, allegedly. Now, during his music career, Tommy Chong, who wished to identify as black due originally to his issues being half Chinese in Calgary, married and had kids with a black girl who was also part Cherokee. During his time with the Vancouvers, Tommy wrote the song Does Your Mama Know About Me, which made it into the top 30 in 1968. Take a wild guess what that song is about. I'll give you a hint. It would fit the same narrative if you wrote another song called Does Your Daddy Have a Heart Condition? Or Does Your Daddy Have Prison Tattoos? And speaking of which, when Cheech and Chong first met, they both spent some time just eyeing each other, trying to figure out what exactly the other one was. Cheech, who was introduced as the very white-sounding Richard Marin, had this oddly round snowman face. According to Chong, he looked like a moon. And Chong, who to my eyes looks pretty white with just a touch of Eastern, could have been a Mongolian biker for all Cheech knew. And by the way, oddly enough, before he took over that nightclub, it was called the Kublai Khan. Chong was also a long-haired hippie. I mean, the first thing that I thought upon seeing Chong from back then for the first time, and I mean this in the nicest possible way, was the pimp from Taxi Driver. So according to Tommy himself, Cheech was the only one in that improv group called the City Works who was actually writing original material, whereas Tommy and the other guys were just using stuff they saw in magazines and live shows like Second City. And it's hard to say with any real certainty, but Cheech may have been the one who started the pair on their great trajectory, by writing their way out of the overused tropes and scenarios of the day. You see, by adding this new material coming from his own life experience, they run a better chance of hitting on something raw. It's like an extra rare steak, you can still find signs of life in there. Not like that Mongolian saddleback meat that's been ridden on for 1,000 miles that Chong and the others were contributing. Of course, it is improv though, so I'm really referring to the extra work that Cheech was doing when not on stage.
I keep saying it, but that guy was a worker. In fact, another gig that he had in Vancouver was to write for a Canadian publication, which led to him being able to meet different celebrities who were visiting town, such as Richard Pryor, who advised him that in comedy, it's all about the material, not the performer, which I'm quite sure he took to heart, as it's quite in line with what his father taught him. It's not enough to simply be known as the funny man, you gotta grind when not on stage. So the City Works had a good thing going for months, so good in fact that the crowd of the club changed, from bikers and drunks to wine-sipping cultural connoisseurs. Or maybe it was just the bikers coming out of the closet, where they keep their nice clothes. At any rate, this new crowd didn't spend enough to keep the club from going under, and when Tommy's brother had a look at the books and pointed this out to Tommy, he knew the improv stuff couldn't continue at this club. And I mean, hindsight is 20/20, right? They could have just had a cover charge. And by the way, according to Tommy, they had made some enemies of the insular theater types, who were envious of the success that they were having despite not being a part of their guild, for lack of a better term. They didn't play by the rules, you know, doing a lot of stuff that's generally considered to be lowbrow. But hey man, the times are always changing, and so are the things that people best relate to. I'm sure powdered wigs will come back someday. So with these regular shows at the club being finished, the improv group mostly just dissolved. Mostly, with the exception of Richard Merritt and Tommy Chong, who wanted to keep the show going in some form, some way. For example, they would enter Battle of the Bands competitions only to perform comedy the entire time, with the musicians they brought along just sitting there not playing a single note. You can't get a much more clear indication than that, then at this point both of them were choosing comedy over music. Eventually, the pair decided to take their act to Los Angeles and see if they could make it big somehow. Due to his time touring with Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers, Chong had some strings he could pull. Only problem was, Cheech was still wanted by the FBI for being an anti-drafter, so now he had to sneak back into the US. Sneak is a strong term though, he actually just crossed using a friend's passport. His friend was white, but people up that way didn't generally see many folks of Mexican descent. It's like, look at this, Frosty the Snowman's here to take our jobs. It's no great wonder why the concept of border crossings would show up in their later work. So we'll leave off here with Tommy Chong and Cheech Marin trying to make it big on the west side. So let's try and gain a better understanding of what exactly they were doing in that club in Vancouver, and afterwards, how the pair continued to develop their different skits. Improv is short for improvisational, and improv comedy is all about cooperating with your fellow actors and bouncing off of their actions and words, and vice versa. And it's not so much about being quick on the draw just to say the next thing to keep things moving along, as it is a team effort for building this narrative in a useful direction. And if another person happens to be blanking out, you pick up the slack for them by providing more information for them to bounce off of, and the show just goes on. It's the many twists and turns along the way that provide the funny. Improv actors play with the audience's expectations, provide a healthy dose of absurdity, and even provide a traditional setup punchline format joke every now and then. There's also a lot of opportunity for callbacks, where they refer to something that was done or said earlier in the skit. Chong has said that he learned his comedy style through his experience with music. He says it's like the jazz music format, but with words. They would establish a framework. For example, they have one skit where they pretend to be dogs, crawling around on stage on all fours, and then they make their jokes off of that premise. This is how Cheech and Chong develop their skits, and even with their well-known skits, they keep changing it up because there's always more room for improvement. Another technique the two like to use is costumes, which assists in getting them into the mental framework of these different characters. I think the reason why these two were the only ones left of the original improv group is because they have such great chemistry together. The way I see it, they are both similar enough that they can connect on certain points, especially with the experiences they've had in Calgary. But Cheech and Chong are also different enough that they can take on complementary roles without looking like one of them has their hand up the other's butt. For the most part, that is. There is some drama later on. So in summary, Cheech and Chong met in a club in Vancouver where they started doing improv together, and then they decided to take their act to LA where they would establish themselves in the comedy scene, while Cheech, an anti-drafter, was probably having a nervous breakdown half the time knowing he was one federal agent in the audience away from being locked up or sent to Nam. So there you have it, the beginning of Cheech and Chong. I hope you all enjoyed, and if you did, you know. I'm enjoying doing this series, so I'm gonna keep focused on it. Gonna be a 3-parter. So let me know in the comments what your favorite skit of theirs is. I'll do some research and talk about it later.